Many important issues were discussed amongst the Allied leaders during the wartime conferences of World War II. Unfortunately, many of the agreements made at these historic conferences were broken in the post-war years. Eastern Europe became an issue for the Allied leaders to discuss when the Soviet army began to occupy this area in 1944. The case of Czechoslovakia demonstrates most clearly how the Soviets went against Stalin's wartime promise and imposed communism on an unwilling nation. Since the war, Czechoslovakia had worked to achieve a non-aligned policy that best served its national interests. When it came to foreign affairs, the Czechs tended to ally themselves with the power Soviet Union, but domestically the Czech government was restoring the democracy that had existed there in the time between the two world wars. To hasten their economic recovery after World War II, the Czech government was in favor of accepting aid offered in the Marshall Plan, which was put into effect after the killing of John Masaryk, the son of the first Czechoslovakian president. But the Soviets did not intend to allow any state within their sphere of influence to become a democracy, as this threatened the security offered by the buffer zone that the Soviets had created. Czechoslovakia, as a result, suffered the same fate as the other nations in Eastern Europe that Stalin had denied the right to participate in the Marshall Plan. Its economy deteriorated, while those of the Western European states began to recover. Stalin rose to this challenge of his authority in Eastern Europe, supported by the Soviet army and Soviet influence, both of which were already strong in Czechoslovakia. The communists carried out a coup in Prague in 1948. Though bloodless, the coup was nonetheless nasty. Leading politicians who advocated democracy were arrested and imprisoned, and the communists infiltrated the government. Shortly after the coup, the Czech president, Edvard Beneš, was ousted from power and replaced by the leader of the Czech Communist Party, Klement Gottwald. The last independent government in Eastern Europe had become communist. Nature of the single-party state. The nature of the single-party state in which occupied Czechoslovakia was more based upon a dictatorial and fear-driven belief. Politically, the communists held the majority of the government positions as well as control of who had the other positions. President Beneš ignited the start of the alliance between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia in 1943. The Soviet control of Czechoslovakia used fear as a tool to make sure they had a strong grasp over Czechoslovakia. While President Beneš was in control, people were unable to talk against the government, and people were restricted in public expression. After Beneš died in 1948, he was succeeded by Gottwald, Zapotocki, Novotny, and Svoboda. In 1968, Alexander Dubček took office as General Secretary and began to implement liberal reforms. After the period of the Prague Spring in 1968, however, Dubček was forced to resign when purges were carried out in Czechoslovakia, where many liberals were sacked. Purges were utilized by the one-party state in order to replace political leaders and groups of people and who did not encompass a set of ideas that the government wanted. Later in 1975, Gustav Husak became the leader of Czechoslovakia. During his leadership, Czechoslovakia was criticized by the West for not bestowing human rights to the Czechs. However, the policies that revolved around fear and dictatorship crumbled when Czechoslovakia became the Czech Republic in 1933, and the new government tried to reform its political and economic policies. Domestic policies. The domestic policies of the Czechoslovakian government after the Soviet seizure of power played a large role in consolidation of power for Soviet communism. The communists conducted purges and utilized methods including censorship to discourage opposition. Czechoslovakian social domestic policy focused on equal redistribution of land, and economic policy focused on a planned centralized economy. Initially, the Communist Party held only a few positions in the government, yet those positions allowed them to choose who took the other positions. However, once Klement Gottwald replaced Edvard Beneš as government president in June 1948, Czechoslovakia was restructured in the Soviet image, banning non-communist organizations, introducing economic planning, collectivizing agriculture, controlling media and education, and utilizing terror and purges, much like Stalin. Similar policies regarding political opponents were carried out until Alexander Dubček replaced Antonin Novotny as first secretary in 1968. Dubček's government employed an approach called socialism with a human face, which finally brought de-Stalinization to Czechoslovakia and allowed broader political discussion, eased censorship, and tried to address Slovak complaints of discrimination. However, Dubček was forced to reverse the changes he made, a process called normalization, and he was eventually forced to resign. His replacement, Husak, arrested those who advocated human rights in order to force people into quiet submission. He reimposed censorship and coordinated the country's economy with Moscow for the next 6 years. Eventually, after the Velvet Revolution in 1989, the Czechoslovak Politburo resigned and economic and social reform was started. The economy moved towards privatization, and in 1992, Czechoslovakia split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, joining NATO in 1999 and 2002 respectively. The Prague Spring of 1968 was the highlight of opposition and dissent in Czechoslovakia against the Czechoslovakian regime. The Prague Spring was a period of openness and free expression in Czechoslovakia during the spring and summer of 1968. This saw in the formerly Stalinist satellite kept a gradual push from within the Communist Party for economic reforms and party democratization. In the spring and summer of 1968, speech flowed freely in public reforms and independent newspapers. These signs, ominous for bloc unity, turned Brezhnev against the Czechoslovak reform. The Soviets led their Warsaw Pact allies in an invasion of Czechoslovakia on August 20th. Czechs only offered symbolic resistance to the 500,000 invading troops. Ultimately, force prevailed, and the USSR installed a new collaborationist government under Gustav Husak. The repression of the Prague Spring proved to be particularly embarrassing to communists around the world. Before the invasion, the general mood was optimistic, but after, it turned to despair. Throughout Europe, communists who had generally accepted even the harsh show trials of Stalinist period lost faith in Soviet leadership. The destruction of socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia was a blow against socialist ideas in general. After 1968, Soviet communism would survive only through threat of force and inertia, and few could any longer envision a socialist utopia. The Prague Spring led to the formation of the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Soviet army wanted to be sure that its command in the heartland of Europe would not be disturbed again. This declared that countries with Soviet-style political systems under Russia would remain under the Warsaw Pact and have only a one-party system. Eventual breakdown of Soviet control. Once Mikhail Gorbachev, the successor of Brezhnev, began to restructure the economy and foreign and domestic policies of the USSR. The hardline communists in Czechoslovakia tried to resist these reforms. However, the dissident groups that began to form in the 1970s became even more adamant. Shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Czechoslovakia's revolution occurred. Peaceful rallies and demonstrations began to break out in Prague on November 19, 1989, and this movement gained much support. Outbreaks had happened in the past, but had been stopped by the police. However, this protest was allowed because it commemorated the 50th anniversary of the killing of Czech university human rights and when political pluralism were banned. During the march, rumor had it that a student had been killed. The security services tried to deny it by exposing 2 unharmed students who shared the same name as the victim's name. Still, the news of the killed students circulated, and foreign correspondents reported the regime's behavior abroad. Czech citizens were angered and fed up by the repression, which included beatings of peaceful, unarmed marchers. It was especially unnerving that the regime denied the obvious actions. Václav Havel then led a wide-based movement which called for the resignation of communist leaders. By the 20th of November, 200,000 people were protesting for a new government in Prague. This became a worldwide general strike on the 27th of November, 1989. At least half the population took part in this march, indicating its high success. Communist Party of Czechoslovakia negotiated with opposing leaders. Husak acknowledged the formation of non-communist parties, causing him to resign his post. Havel then became president. Finally, on December 10th, the communist leaders gave power to a new non-communist government. The transfer of power was so speedy and yet so peaceful that it was termed as the Velvet Revolution. Lastly, in 1993, the two states decided to divide into Czech Republic and Slovakia. This is also known as the Velvet Divorce.